This is an example of a fairly standard turn newel post. We use a lot of these in the houses that we build, but if I get a chance, I like to build something that really shows off my craftsmanship a little bit more. This is a very basic frame and panel construction detail, but we'll take 4 of these and put them together to make what's called a box newel. When it's all together, it looks like a pretty complicated project, but it's really pretty easy to put these together using pocket hole construction. And the great part about it is I don't have any clamping time, so as quickly as I can put the joints together, I'm ready to go on to the next step. We'll also use pocket holes to attach a couple of the components together. Again, what we're looking for is the ability to create a really strong joint quickly and without the use of a lot of hands and clamps. It's important to remember that the plywood that you place on the back of this newel post has to be cut on a 45. That's so that as we put the frames together, the pieces of plywood don't run into each other. We'll be able to get a better look at what I'm talking about when we assemble the first newel post. Another thing that's really important to remember is you want to design your newel post in such a way that there's enough room for the handrail, and the handrail actually is going to be fall into this part of the post, but it's important to remember to leave enough room for that handrail to hit in there. Later on, we're going to go back and cover a little bit about layout, but what's important to remember right now is this newel post is really just going to be 4 or 5 simple components. We'll have the 4 frames that we'll put together. We're going to have some moldings that go around the bottom. We'll have some moldings that go around this part, and then we're going to have a cap. Again, when it's all done, it's going to look like a pretty complex project, but really all it is just a simple set of steps that you have to follow to get a great end result. The first step that we're going to need to do is to cut all the pieces to identical size. Again, one of the great things about this type of construction is we're making a lot of repetitive cuts. It's going to be important to get those exactly the same size. That's why we're going to use a very special setup on our saw to make certain that we have identical sized pieces. One of the most important things to remember when you're putting together frames using pocket screws, the pocket screw is going to pull the joint together at whatever angle your pieces have been cut. So it's always important to make sure that your saw is cutting really square before you get started. The simplest way that I know to do that is find a board that's fairly wide, and I'm going to make a cut in the middle, and then I will flip the pieces over. If the saw is not cutting square, if it's say a 64th off, when I flip it over, it's going to double that margin of error so I'll be able to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that piece, flip it over, and hopefully we're going to be cutting real well. Okay, I can't even see any gap in between there, so this saw is cutting really well. So, we're in good shape on that. Now, the next thing that we need to do is get a stop system set up so that we can cut the same exact length pieces or extremely close to the exact same length pieces. What that means is all the openings are going to be the same size, so all these pieces of molding are going to be the same size. Again, it's just paying attention to small details are going to make all the other steps that follow a lot easier. The length of this rail needs to be 6 inches. Now, all the fence systems I've used before all have one issue that you have to deal with, and that is you can't really set the system up to cut anything less than about 12 to 13 inches. The way that I get around that is I cut a block that's 10 inches long, so in order to get a 6-inch finished piece, I'm going to set my guide system over here on 16 inches and lock it in. And so with my 10-inch piece against it, when I bring the board over against the 10-inch piece, I'm going to always end up with a 6-inch finished piece. Now, one of the things that's always important to remember anytime you're using a miter saw, no matter what kind of cut you're making is, don't let sawdust build up on the bed of the saw. And here it's going to be especially important not to let sawdust build up here, because if I start getting a pile of sawdust up in here, I'm going to end up with a board that's too short. Another thing that's very, very important when you're making this type of cut, you want to keep the saw in the down position until the blade stops moving. If you start raising it up with the blade moving, you may start launching pieces, and the worst case scenario, you could end up with a piece wedged in the saw that would damage the saw or the blade. Now, of course, we're building a frame, a Newel post that's got 4 pieces, so I've just got this step 4 times. And if I've done this right when we get through, all the pieces should be exactly the same length. And that's pretty close. Now that we've got those pieces cut to the same length, we're going to go over and put the pocket holes in the back of them. Now we're ready to drill the pocket holes. One of the great things about pocket holes, I only have to deal with 1/2 of the joint. If I was using biscuits, I'd have to do something to each of the pieces. But with the pocket holes, I'm just going to drill holes in each end of these pieces. And this guide allows me, it's a stop block, which allows me to center the pocket holes on the piece each time. The clamp's going to hold it in place for me. And then I've just got to drill a couple holes. The only thing you have to concentrate on while you're doing this is to make sure that each time you're actually drilling the holes in the back of the board, because this is really a pretty quick process. You can get on a roll, and the next thing you know, you drill some holes in the front of the board. Sometimes I'll even take and put, like a pencil marker, an X or something on what's going to be the back of the board, so that I know if I'm not seeing that pencil mark, I better not be drilling. Okay, those pieces are ready to go. Now we're ready to screw them together. Well, we've already prepared the first part of the frame, which are the rails. The second part of the frame are the stiles. I've marked the locations where the rails are going to be put in on the stiles. The thing that's most important to remember about these stiles, they've got to have good square edges. Again, just as the pocket screws are going to pull the joint together tight, whether it's on 90 degrees or not, if these edges aren't square, we're not going to get a flat frame. So one of the things that I'll usually do is run my stile pieces through a planer, and that also gives me a very clean edge, so I'm going to get a good joint. Now, you have to start with a piece that's been ripped on the table saw with a blade at 90 degrees. The things to remember: start with a good cut with the table saw, run it through a planer to get a good smooth edge, and you're going to have success. Really a pretty straightforward process. Okay. Now, this clamp is going to really help us to put the joints together. We'll be using a special screw. This screw has a self-tapping end on it, so I don't have to drill any kind of pilot holes. That's one of the things that makes putting frames together with pocket screws go quickly. I don't have to do a lot of special steps. Once I've got the screw holes drilled in the rails, everything's going to go together rather quickly. I usually go ahead and use some glue. Probably wouldn't have to. The joint that I could put together using just the pocket screws is going to be stronger than a dowel or a biscuit. But I still like to put some glue in there. It just makes me feel better about it. All right. I'm going to position the piece where it's centered underneath the clamp. Put a little bit of glue on it. You can also do this using a face frame clamp that Kreg provides, but I'm kind of spoiled. I just love using this clamp. It always works better when you have the drill going forward. We're using a fine thread screw here because we're going into oak. They also make a coarse thread screw which will work on softwoods. Now I'm going to tell you, that's just a joint that's just about ready to be put together. Take very, very little sanding. It's also an incredibly tight joint. If I'd been using biscuits or dowels or something, I'd be about an hour away from a tight joint. I've instantly got a tight joint. So I can just keep on going. Yeah, I can put a little bit of glue on that joint just to make me feel better about it. One of the great things about this too is with pocket screws, that joint can be put together anywhere. Some forms of fastening frames together, you don't have very much forgiveness, but this is really forgiving about the way things go together, which I usually need all the forgiveness I can get. I keep working my way down. Okay, now all I've got to do is flip it over. Now I will want to go ahead and put the glue on all these pieces at one time, because once you start pulling those joints together with the pocket screws, you don't really have a chance to get back in there and add the glue later. Okay, let's see how our joints turned out on the front. The amazing part is the first joint I ever put together with the pocket screw was that good. It's really a simple process. For about the first 5 or 6 years that I was using pocket hole construction, everything was putting together butt joints like this where you've got 2 boards flat. A few years back, Kreg Tool developed these right angle clamps, and it's a tool that we have really started using a lot. It's kind of changed the way we think about putting a lot of things together. What they allow you to do is to join 2 boards at a right angle like this. Where that's really helpful is instead of having to have a whole lot of clamps to hold 2 pieces together, we're going to be using our pocket screws to put the joint together. Now, I'm not a big fan of mitered corners, so I would much rather put together a butt joint like this. There's not a really good way that I know of to actually glue and clamp a long mitered joint like this together, but if I put this joint together using pocket screws, I end up with a very, very good joint. It's a very strong joint that's not going to move, because I've seen times when I had a good 45 joint, but then over time it opened back up. I've never had a joint like this that's put together with glue and pocket screws open back up. So that's why I like to do this. Now Larry's going to be helping me here. I could do this by myself, but it really helps to have someone with you. Also, anytime that I put together a joint like this, I want to put it together with just a slight bit of an offset, and then I'm going to come back, wipe the excess glue out of the way, and flush trim it with a router bit. Now we're going to be using 2 of these clamps so that we can just work our way right down the board. All right, Larry, if you just kind of hold on to that for a second. Now again, the peg of this clamp is going to go in to the pocket hole. Now I need to knock that back just a little bit. Okay, good. I'm making sure I have that little bit of an offset that I was talking about. Okay. Keep it kind of uniform. Now when we put the panel mold inside these openings, all these holes are going to be covered up by the panel mold. So though right now we're seeing a lot of holes, they're all going to go away when we actually construct the post. All right. we've got that together, what I'm going to do is just wipe this excess glue. Occasionally people ask me, what's all this mess on my nail apron? It actually takes about 15 years to get your nail apron to look like this. Okay. Now we're ready to go ahead and we're going to attach another piece on the other side, and then we'll be ready to, for the last piece, we'll go ahead and use some clamps to clamp it up. It might be possible to get inside here with a right angle drill and do it, but we're just going to go ahead and use some clamps for the last piece. Right now we're going to go ahead and attach another frame in exactly the same way to this other side. Okay, let me just tap that back a little bit. Okay, that's the last screw for this side. We're going to attach the other face in the same way. The only trick is, because we're going to have a little bit tighter access hole to work in, we're going to have to use a shorter driver, and we'll either put it in a right angle drill or we'll put it in a ratchet. But the same process, just a little bit harder to do. Before we put the fourth panel on, we're going to add some glue and put the plywood backing on these two. A lot of the strength of holding these panels in place will be done by the moldings that eventually finish up. Yeah, Larry, can you reach through there? We don't have a whole lot of overlap, and that has to do, again, we're trying to make certain that these plywood panels don't bump into each other in the corner. Okay, we've got some 1¼ brads here that we're just going to shoot a few of them in. Once again, you might want to move your fingers this time, Larry. Okay. All right, we're ready for the last side. Okay, we've got a great joint here. It's almost invisible, and the reason that the joint's that tight is the pocket screws are holding the wood together, and we paid close attention to the details to start with. We made sure we had good square edges. One of the real benefits to me for this is we didn't have to wait for the glue to dry. We were able to just screw the joint together and then go to work. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this material, don't forget to like and subscribe.